How do you reconcile with the reality that the Bible was written down, at least, by human beings, and that human beings are generally unreliable? What do you make of like the Old Testament? What do you make of the origins of the Dead Sea Scrolls? If it really is an intelligent force that made us to think the way it thinks, why would it have war? Why would it have murder? Why would it have all the horrific crimes that we see, drug addictions? Why would it create us in a form like that?
Welcome to this episode of Land and the Bible, and we're going to do something interesting today. This is the first time we've kind of done something this specific. I guess we've done some other kind of reaction videos.
We did the Graham Norton,
Graham Hancock,
whatever his name is.
Different Graham.
Yeah, we did the pyramids. We did that one.
Yeah. He loves to talk about the pyramids and global floods and stuff.
Yeah.
But this was kind of serpents.
Can we work serpents in this one today?
I'm sure we could. With this one, so Stephen Meyer was on Joe Rogan, which I didn't even realize he was going to be on there, but it was really interesting, and he did a really good job. So if you don't know who Stephen Meyer is, I guess he's a philosopher of science.
Well, yeah. If I was going to define Meyer, I would just say he is the leading proponent of sort of the intelligent design movement.
Yeah.
You know, but trying to really criticize Darwinism, I would say, and make the argument that the intelligent design of the universe and of the humans and the animals in it should be regarded as science and not your religious ideas. You know?
Well, and I'll say he's a critic of Darwin, but he's not a critic of the fossil record or evolution, so to speak.
No,
he's not a young Earth creationist.
I mean,
he's not a young Earth creationist.
Yeah, that's probably true.
He's older Earth, but he would say God interacted.
But he's very skeptical of like what I would call speciation. That one species gave rise to another. He's certainly hypercritical of
universal common descent,
abiogenesis. That you have life springing from not life. That there was a puddle and it just had some stuff in it, a lightning bolt hit it, and poof, there's a cell.
Yeah. Like scientifically, he'll go, and in fact, in this interview, he talks about a lot of that stuff, and he's like, "Let me tell you why." So his book, Signature in the Cell, is one. The Return to the God hypothesis is another.
He basically argues that information requires an author.
Yeah.
Anytime you see writing, a person did it. It wasn't on accident, and And so therefore, if there's information, if there's writing, someone had to write it, and therefore it is not a scientific to assume, an intelligent designer. Like he's I think he's the head of the Design Institute. Like he's the head of a group that really advocates for that.
Yeah.
And what he does, like I actually like Meyer an awful lot.
Yeah.
What he does is he understands the culture he's living in. He understands the politics, whatever. He doesn't directly, he is a very, very devout biblical Christian, but in that context, he doesn't necessarily argue for, we should be teaching Genesis in the classroom. What he argues for is it is valid to teach that this had to be designed, that there's no way that this protein and this protein and this protein that all work together could have arisen by chance separately. That's not possible. It had to be designed as a unit, is kind of the arguments that he makes, and he's brilliant. And so, people hate him, but they also can't win an argument with him. Is kind of how things go.
Yep.
So I think what's going to happen today is we're going to play some clips and then we're going to react. Play a clip and react. Play a clip and react. It's going to kind of go like that. What I would like to say from the outset is that I am in absolutely no way critiquing Stephen Meyer. I think he did a absolutely brilliant job. The reason we want to do this is because it's a fairly important cultural moment. I mean, Joe Rogan is the single biggest thing in media, period. I don't think there's any question of that. He gets at least tens, sometimes hundreds of millions of views on podcasts. I mean, it dwarfs, and I mean dwarfs traditional media. You think like Fox, CNN, MSNBC, if they get 1 million or 2 viewers per night, they're doing great. This guy he crushes that every day, crushes it. Far, far more people listen to him than listen to those guys.
Yeah.
And Joe Rogan is has been for years very, very critical of Christianity. What he normally does, or if you go back 2 or 3 years ago at least, what he typically does when any form of Christianity comes up, he basically strawmans a ludicrous, fake, stereotyped idea of bad Christianity, says how stupid that is, and kind of moves on.
He usually throws in that it's mythology.
Yeah, something like that, and just go. And I have said for years, I wish he would, because he's normally quite brave about bringing people on with sort of non-mainstream ideas, and famously pushed back against like vaccines and things like that. So he's usually kind of brave about being willing to think. And I've always thought, I wish he would get a smart Christian on instead of just beating up Christian ideas in the absence of an intelligent advocate for them. I wish he'd get a smart Christian on. And he finally did. I wanted him to bring on William Lane Craig.
Well, there's like a petition, I think, going around about
for him to do that.
Yeah.
If he does that, I'll be a very, very happy camper.
Yeah.
But he did about the next best thing in bringing on Meyer. Now Meyer's a little more of a scientist and a philosopher, but also a very devout Christian. And what you're gonna, if you haven't watched the full, Rogan does long.
It's a 3-hour episode.
Yeah. If you're not willing to watch 3 hours, I get it. If you're willing to, what you're going to see is that Stephen Meyer is a brilliant, brilliant man. They clearly had different opinions, and there's push and pull within those opinions, but they're both, again, congenial and respectful, which I really, really admire. I think our culture needs more of that. The ability to disagree well. We're not very good at that right now. So I really liked that about the interview.
But I think they actually agree on some stuff. Like, I think Rogan brought him on because he's like, yeah, materialism isn't all there is.
Yeah, that's probably true. But he's certainly not willing to embrace the God of the Bible. Like, he ain't nowhere near.
But he definitely is I think he is like.
I think he's thinking now.
Yeah.
I think he's been moved a little bit, by some, like the Jordan Petersons of the world, stuff like that.
Yeah, a little bit of
he's
DMT.
Yeah, and the drugs. Yeah, and the drugs. He likes his pot and his hallucinogens.
Yeah.
But anyway, why we want to talk about it is I think there were some things that Rogan said that because Meyer wanted to take it out of the personal and get back to sort of the ID, intelligent design conversation. And also because he only had 3 hours. He didn't have time to answer everything. And so I just wanted us to go through, run some clips, and then comment on them because I think there are some things that, it would be fun to add our 2 cents to. Now that, again, Stephen Meyer, he's in the arena, we're like Monday morning quarterbacking. We've had hours to think about it and postulate what we should have said. So again, this is no critique at all.
Yeah.
But there are some things I think that are worth adding that clear up some of the points. And, it'll just be fun to sort of react to a cultural moment. So
Yep. Yeah. And
we're about to be unscripted.
Yeah, we're definitely unscripted because I just have a list of time codes sitting right here on my computer. But I'll say the other thing that is kind of interesting and how I feel like this fits in is some of these things may be like, why are we touching on them? Because some of these are things that we don't ever really talk about on here. Like, how often are we talking about intelligent design? I mean, we'll sometimes talk about metaphysical philosophy versus like in relationship to maybe Paul and like, what he was facing and how it relates to us today and that kind of thing. But I think the thing that's interesting is a lot of these, I think for us as Christians, we've talked about before on our content, how Christianity is a philosophical worldview. Well, in this case, especially with Stephen Meyer, philosophy intersects with science in a really cool way. So he takes these like philosophical ideas and then these tangible, testable, researched, widely held scientific, not beliefs, but I would say evidences. And then he kind of uses those to build this case for intelligent design, among other things, which, at its core, it's basically the universe being intelligent design versus being random versus being, just materialistic. So I think that's kind of cool. Well, the first clip I have, we'll have to see what happens when we watch it and what we think about it. But he's just explaining from his perspective what the mind behind the universe concept means for us. And I think this is really interesting because it kind of shows us the foundation of like arguing against materialism, and also just maybe where science came from in general. All right, so let's just give this one a play.
If we try to justify our ability to know the world around us by empirical data, by things we observe, this was Hume's argument. Can't do it. He was a radical empiricist and found that in order to make any sense of the sense impressions he had to presuppose the uniformity of nature. But to prove the uniformity of nature, he had to make reference to sensory observations. And so he was arguing in a circle. And so it came down, you couldn't justify the reliability of assumptions we make in our minds by observing the world. You had to use those assumptions to make sense of the observations. But if you presupposed that our minds were made by a benevolent creator who gave us those assumptions in order to make sense of the world that he also made, then there was a principle of correspondence between the way the mind worked and the way the world worked, in which case we could trust the basic reliability of the mind. And this turns out to be one of the key foundational assumptions that gave rise to modern science. It was called the idea of intelligibility. Newton, Boyle, Kepler, the great founders of modern science, thought that nature had secrets to reveal. There were patterns there to be revealed that we could understand because our minds had been made in the image of the same rational creator who had built rationality and design and pattern and lawful order into the world.
Okay, so that's basically his kind of philosophical take on why
science. Science developed. Science developed because of an assumption of intelligibility.
Right.
And and then he's saying that there are skeptics out there. This gives rise to modern postmodernism, whatever. This gives rise to postmodernism later, but there are skeptics who say, and he mentioned Hume and Kant, that basically say, well, you can't actually prove that your mind or your senses work properly, which at a certain level is actually correct. You can't prove that. You can't prove that your eyes work because any test to prove that your eyes work, somebody's using their eyes to look at something to verify whether you saw the right thing, or you're using eyes to verify eyes, and therefore it's circular and it's bad. To try to verify your mind, you have to use your mind. Am I thinking properly? Well, I think I'm thinking properly because of this and that. But if your mind is damaged enough, then, you could be unconscious somewhere and you're dreaming about it, or you could be hallucinating something, right. and it seems like reality to you. It seems like you're being rational, but you're actually not because your mind is broken.
Yeah.
And so he's right in saying that to move forward with science, we have to make assumptions. And it's not, we have this assumption about assumptions where we say like, oh, that's bad. You shouldn't assume things. You know what you do when you assume, we kind of have that in our culture, but no, all worldviews have a set of ideas at their foundation that they can't prove. There are some things that we simply can't prove. So for me as a Christian, I believe in a benevolent God, and I believe that benevolent God made a good world that he put me in, and that he gave me a mind and senses that could perceive and understand the world, and that it is intelligible. I believe that God is a God of order, not of chaos. And therefore that, this is why all of the Christian scientists, we're obsessed with putting math to things. What's the math behind the curvature of light in a lens? What's the math behind gravity? The things that Newton is doing. Why were they so into math? Because they thought that there's a rule.
Well, and I love that he referenced that. And and for me, it's like a lot of the stuff that I listen to or from a skeptical perspective, listening to an atheist or skeptics talk about Christian faith or not believing in God or whatever. There's this angle of like being a skeptic is a good thing, and I think when I listen to his explanation that we just talked about, just listened to, it makes me realize how much you can't really know anything unless you have some type of metaphysical like truth.
Yeah.
And I think we've talked about this before, and this is what has led to, like he said, like has led to the rise of postmodernism, where there is no real truth.
It's only perspective.
It's all perspective. So everything is subjective. But then if everything is subjective, then you're either your own truth or you just can't know truth. So it becomes this kind of circular thing, but that's why it's so important. And to have an external truth, like to have God speaking in to, our reality philosophically. And, honestly, with skepticism and materialism, putting those together, you're not left with anything, but skepticism in reality doesn't work, because much like you just said, if you really can't know anything, if you can't know that what you're seeing is correct, if you can't know then what you're feeling is correct, if you can't know what your relationships are correct, then it's like, well, what are you left with?
Yeah, and I think that's what I wanted to land this segment on, was the fact that people voice these skepticisms. You can't trust a story, you can't trust words, you can't trust your mind, you can't trust this, that, and the other. But nobody can live like that. Mm-hmm. Like all of these sort of philosophies or ideas are, in the end, they're just kind of dumb. Because we're thinking about something, we're talking about something, but you know what? You can't live like it. So the Christian assumption, Jesus talks about how, like, if you build on me, you're building on a rock. If you not build on me, you're building on sand. It's just not stable. It's just you're going to build this structure and it's going to collapse. All these intellectual structures that are built not on God, they're built on sand. Mm-hmm. So they're underlying assumptions. And again, everyone's got underlying assumptions. Rogan assumes miracles aren't possible. He assumes resurrection's not possible, clearly. And he's going to go forward with that. So then he's hearing the Bible. He's like, well, those parts are lies then, so that he's got an underlying assumption. We have them as well. I believe there's a real benevolent God that made this world. And then I think that's a more stable set of underlying assumptions. Those are built on rock, not on sand. And so then I feel like we as Christians can build intellectual structures that stand up a lot better, that hold up. You can actually live like a Christian. You can live like you believe a good God in heaven made a good earth, and they gave me a sound mind that I can use to understand it, and to move forward in it. That makes a lot more sense to me than the skepticism that he's describing there.
And if the universe is just random events, then why should it make sense? Yeah. If it's all a bunch of randomness, then how do you make intelligibility out of randomness?
That's right. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. How do you make a mind that can perceive and understand?
Yeah.
In senses as well. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, let's do the next one. So this next one, I have it listed as evil. So let's see. So I think they're talking about, why is there evil in the world if there's an intelligent designer?
First of all, I want to go back one step further. You were saying something about, and I'm paraphrasing, but whatever this intelligent thing is, creating us somehow or another in its image, or somehow or another thinking the way it thinks. How did you say that again?
Yeah, this was the idea of the early scientists who got science going. It was the way they've talked about it was the intelligibility of the universe. It was intelligible. Mm-hmm. It could be understood by us because our minds had been made in the image or likeness of the creator of the universe itself.
Isn't it just possible that our minds are complex and curious, and so we're trying to figure out what all these things are, and what DNA is, and what molecules, and that we're trying to figure out the very fiber of existence itself. What is it made out of? Wouldn't any curious, self-aware creature start to contemplate these things? And if it really is an intelligent force that made us to think the way it thinks, why would it have war? Why would it have murder? Why would it have all the horrific crimes that we see, drug addictions? Why would it create us in a form like that?
Yeah. So, well, again, which Meyer, what he's saying too, there's two totally separate things there. The first thing he goes into is, well, why is it so special that we're exploring our universe? Wouldn't any intelligent, creative creature try to figure out what DNA is? And then we got this, that, and the other. There is, I guess it's a theme, a constantly repeated idea in skeptic circles, which I think really tries to demean humans. It tries to make us really not much better than anything else. There's no difference between us and a goldfish.
They touch on that later in this interview too.
Yeah, well, he says like, well, chimpanzees, have complex communication, and what about koalas or something? Koalas are actually really stupid. That's a bad example. But
I think he says like whales and dolphins and stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So he goes in, and that's about communication, and they'll talk about all sorts of different sort of behaviors, and they'll be like, well, but there are some things that you got to know. I mean, you start talking about the complexity of chimp or whale communication. Okay, that's fine. Would they ever write? There's no chimpanzee authored books out there. There's no whale authored books. What they ever build? You ever found a school?
Only in the multiverse.
Yeah, there you go. Look, here's how you can prove the great order of difference. This is Berlinski. Berlinski's great, by the way. Berlinski says, well, here's the deal. If there's ever somebody in a cage and somebody looking out of the cage, we're always the ones outside of the cage. That's true. No monkey ever built a cage, captured a human, and put them in it. There are so many ways that we are superior, and it's sort of annoying in a way to have them say like, well, any intelligent creature. What on earth? How do you just think intelligent creatures just pop up out of the ground at random? That's just a thing that happens on accident.
Well, yeah, I think
something with conscience that has a mind that works.
That's how the argument goes.
It's insanity, though. And even if you believe that argument, you're down to 2 or 3 options in a few billion years. If you believe everything they say, how many actual intelligent creatures capable of logical thought and communication, and architecture and literature. Well, now you're down to just humans. The idea that, well, any creature would be able to have that capacity. What are you talking about? That's just not true.
Eventually, with enough time, which he does get onto that and talks about how, it's not possible. Like, you're just going to destroy the code. I mean, he goes into the whole evolutionary process a good bit in this.
Yeah,
in this
and
interview.
there's another guy I really like named James Tour. I don't know if you listen to Tour or not.
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
But so James Tour, his whole deal is abiogenesis. Like the thing that he just always just like punches.
He's origin of life guy.
Yeah. So there's the idea that you have biogenesis. You have the genesis at the beginning of biotic things of biology, but it's abiotic. You go from abiotic to biotic, and he's like, no. The only place proteins get made are in a cell. Cells are made of proteins. That's a problem. Proteins never pop up anywhere except for in a cell where they are manufactured. How do you solve that? Science guys. And basically what he argues is there's no way you can ever get from you can get from biological chemistry to biological chemistry. And what he argues is that the time actually becomes an enemy, because you have to assume you have all these precursors and they're in the soup and all of a sudden a cell, which is crazy, insane on the face. But even making the assumptions, you have to have those things in that soup for a long time and keep rolling the dice to eventually hit that 1 in 10 billion where they kind of pop together the right way. But what he argues is the time becomes your enemy. You don't get that many rolls of the dice because everything breaks down. So once they're all formed and they're in the same space, you only got a few minutes. So time doesn't work as your ally anymore. And even the Darwinians, when they're being honest, will tell you that, like, and again, this is going with their explanations of everything. They look at the fossil record and you have like the Cambrian explosion where you go from like very, very few complex things to thousands upon thousands of complex things. And even they will like, it's hard to explain why it all happens so fast.
So just for people that don't know what the Cambrian explosion is, it's a point in evolutionary past in the fossil record, where you get all the major body plans of that time period, like all at once.
Yeah.
So I've heard kind of Darwinian, neo-Darwinists maybe say that, there is enough time to get that. But
well, then they'll come up with explanations like punctuated equilibrium. Yeah, we have equilibrium moments and like something happens. We don't really know what that something is.
See,
There's like radiation or there's like, I don't know what. The message goes out and then all the mutating starts and things start changing. And you get all this change that happens quickly at certain periods. It sounds like days of creation to me, but you know.
I know that's the thing is I'm like, well, okay. Well, what is that punctuated equilibrium?
Yeah, why is equilibrium for millions of years and poof, there's a change and poof, there's a change. Yeah, it sounds like
it's very interesting. Yeah, so that's like part of
that's
this
the first half of the critique,
and then the second one was around evil. And
war.
The
whole thing where he's just like, well, you should assume that anything should just be rational, be intelligent. We don't have any idea how a mind works or how one popped up or what consciousness is, and just assume that like. That should just happen randomly is, I think, a really, really bad underlying assumption. So that's the first half of his critique. And then the second half of that line of reasoning is, well, if there is a God who's so smart and designed everything, why war? Why cancer? I mean, right? That's sort of the question.
The problem of evil,
yeah. C.S. Lewis wrote a book, The Problem of Pain. Yeah. Why is there pain in the universe and why is there death? And I mean, the classic Christian answer, and you know, we were talking privately earlier, and this is just true. I really tend to default to the classical answers because I think the classical hundreds of years old, thousands of years old answers sometimes are still around because they're really strong. They're strong answers. If they were easily squashed and put in a corner, then they wouldn't still be the classical answer, you know? Mm-hmm. Like I tend to default to the traditional classical answer until somebody really proves me wrong about something or really, you know, and sometimes, you know, I do change my opinion on things. You know, learn and grow. But the classical answer on this is that God didn't want puppets. He wanted free agents. Mm-hmm. And he gave us true free agency. And with with actual true freedom, we abuse it. So it's not on God, the designer. There's these things. Now, then you say, well, couldn't God look forward and see the fact that you were going to do bad things with it? Yeah, I think he could. But I think in his infinite wisdom, he decided that the existence of real love, mm-hmm. as opposed to just building robots who were like, we love you, you know, because we have to, was worth that, you know, and also real love amongst humans. And I mean, as Christians, we believe the great commandment, love God, love people. That's what God longs to see is this growing, loving family mm-hmm. of creatures that what he's created, that to have that was worth the collateral damage. Now you can question that if you want to,
right?
You know, it's not worth it. It's not, you know, all this pain to get.
Well, and I've heard arguments around it's even the things that we don't do. Like there's obviously things that free will causes us pain, right? Mm-hmm. We choose bad stuff, but then there are things that people don't choose that are bad. But you could say, well, I mean, you could look at the sins of the father, you know, as the generational thing. You could look, I mean, there's like all these other things in the Bible that kind of ferret that out a little bit more. I've also heard about, well, if the, I don't know if they get into it in this one. They maybe do touch on it in this conversation right here. But if the universe is finely tuned, as he talks about, then why is there so much death? Why is there millions of years of animals dying horrendous ways? And if you ever listen to Hugh Ross, he basically says, well, the reason why there's so many, and he's great, by the way. If you like Stephen Meyer, go listen to Hugh Ross. But he says, well,
and just to unpack Hugh Ross, he is a biblical literalist, but he is not a young earther. Like he's
an old earth like scientist.
He basically believes the days of creation are millions of years long.
Yeah, but man, he's so just the way that he unpacks it. But he basically says, yeah, I mean that was just the fossil record is there for us to enjoy the benefits of the natural resources.
Sure.
And we do, and
there
so
wouldn't be any oil if there hadn't been lots of plants died, and you know, to make the.
I mean, and I think it's a great argument. You're like that; those dinosaurs are there for one because they're cool, and they're massive and they create a lot of fossil fuel and other stuff. So it's kind of an interesting take when you start to like back up and you look at not looking at things in an isolated way, but looking at it in the context of like what we've been provided in order to get to where we are as a species and as a civil.
The Bible talks about like Jesus coming in the fullness of time.
Right.
And God's very patient, and he's willing to maybe even spend millions of years caressing things and nudging them to get them to where that moment that he wants.
Yeah.
So just because we live in a very remarkable, special moment in the history of this universe, look, if you're a critic or a skeptic, you might say, well, that's awfully narcissistic. You think you're living in this Goldilocks moment, this Goldilocks place.
I mean, that's what
it kind of looks like, it doesn't it?
Well, we are. I mean,
we actually live. Yeah, that's right. We're
in an extended non ice age time in human civilization.
Sure. No, we're definitely in a good time to be. So yeah, all of that is true. Just regarding the again, sort of the problem with pain and evil issue. What I like to sort of land with all of that is to say, look, there are arguments to be made there, and I think it might even be the strongest criticism of Christianity is what if you have a fully benevolent, all powerful God, why suffering? Again, my answer is because God wants real love to exist, and that can't exist with robots, and so He had to give us choice. But that does come with, at a cost. That's clearly true. My take would be that God thought it was worth the price. Now, regarding freedom and free will, you've got really two critics of free will. You have Christian critics of free will, sort of the Calvinist reform position, and you also have the atheist critics of free will. So the atheist critic of free will, who basically would say, there's nothing on this earth or in this universe but physics and chemistry. Your brain is just a computer. You just have an illusion of consciousness. It's not real. They would argue, and you have illusion of choice, but what you really are is a pinball going down a hill, and you just kind of bounce where you're supposed to and follow the path of least resistance. So, I think I chose my breakfast this morning, but what really happened is I've been pre-programmed by a lifetime of experience to think I want coffee in the morning because the culture I live in. And it just so happens that there's a Starbucks across the street from your office. And therefore on the way over, I grabbed, bacon Gruyere bites and a mocha.
Well, that's because I asked for bacon Gruyere bites.
Yeah, but I get them too. So, but the point, they would argue that's just like a path of least resistance choice. It's actually, if someone understood me well enough, they could predict that choice. And I wouldn't actually have to make it, which is kind of true. My wife could have predicted that for you.
No,
my wife could have told you, is there a Starbucks within a mile or two? Yeah, he's going for a mocha and Gruyere bites. Like she could have told you that.
Well, they actually talk about that in this interview. They talk about, Rogan brings up, well, isn't it just determinism?
Right.
And how can you say, someone's going to do that. They're going to go, certain people are just going to do certain things and they're going to end up in jail, and other people are going to do certain things and not.
So that's a non-Christian, like, again, that's a secular look at determinism. And in what I would say to that is actually total agreement with what Stephen Meyer says. He says it more complicated. What I would basically say is that there are circumstances that make you more likely to do dumb things. Maybe it's because you didn't have a dad in your house to teach you properly. Maybe it's because you were poor and you didn't get to go to the right kind of school. Maybe it's just because you're drunk on a Friday night and you're angry because your girlfriend just left you. That there are certain kinds of circumstances that predispose you to doing something stupid, something violent,
like being a male.
That's probably one of them. Well, that is why 90% of people in jail are male, I think, is because we are more predisposed, I think, to being violent.
Hold my beer.
So, but just because, whatever percentage of violence has the following things around it, alcohol, some sort of like personal trauma, anger thing that pushes you more towards a bad decision, just because, again, probably fatherlessness, 90% of men in jail are from single parent homes, so you've got a set of things that predispose you. That's true, but they are not sufficient to force you to do it. Because you could find plenty of guys from single family homes who got drunk, whose girlfriend broke up with them, who didn't kill anybody.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so to take away the dignity of humans to make a choice, I think is wrong. You know, which I think is what Meyer's getting at, which is to say, yes, there are predetermining factors. There are factors that seem to push you in the direction of making a bad choice, but you still choose. I think that's going to be the biblical perspective, and I think it's just the honest perspective. Because if that wasn't true, then how do you explain the people who don't do that? You know, who have all the very same factors, who have that moment of anger when they're flushed and they could just do something really destructive, but something in them says, don't do it, man. You know that's wrong. And they're like, whew, and they step back from that precipice. Mm-hmm. You know, and you could look at all sorts of negative sorts of behaviors with that, you know, whether it be, I mean, I'm a Christian, about sins, you know, or there's adultery or murder or whatever. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's predetermining things that push you towards it. You still get to make a choice. And I think that's what he's arguing. And regarding the Christian critique of free will, the Calvinist perspective, you know, for my Calvinist friends out there, I love you, but I am definitely certainly not a Calvinist at all. Like I push back against that because I agree with the classical Christian answer, which is that God wants to be loved by agents who chose to love him. Mm-hmm. You know, I believe that, you know, and I don't think that their answers regarding the problem of pain and death are as compelling.
There's a much bigger theological kind of like
that's a whole episode if you want to go down that path.
Yeah, I fit more. I'm definitely free will, but I think that both can be true with with another dimension of time. With God being in another dimension of time, I think foreknowledge is not
causality.
Yes, foreknowledge is not causality. So,
and any parent knows that. You know what your kids are going to do if they do it half the time. Doesn't mean you made them.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Okay, so the next clip is about the multiverse. Do you want me to play that one?
Sure.
All right, let's play that one.
Like, what are your thoughts of this concept of multiple universes?
I love to talk about the multiverse.
Or infinite universes.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised it.
Okay, so that's just like a short clip of him saying, Rogan basically asking about the multiverse.
Yeah, and they go on with it, and it comes up a few more times, just sort of the ideas behind it.
So you probably have a take, and then I probably have a take, and
we'll see where this goes.
Yeah.
All right. So my take on multiverse is this: I think that the fine-tuning data has become so strong because there are dozens of laws of physics, you know, whether you're talking about the coefficient of gravity, how strong gravity pulls, whether you're talking about the nuclear forces that hold, you know, atoms together, where, you know, how strong or how weak they are, the speed of light, how far the sun is away from us, how far the moon is away from us, the size of our planet, the size of our sun, the fact that Jupiter's out there sweeping up all the asteroids so we don't just get bombarded all the time. You know, this big giant thing with a really strong gravity field sort of cleans up the solar system for us. And
it's like our own Roomba.
Yeah, it kind of is actually in a lot of ways. And it just kind of goes on and on and on and on. The resonance of certain molecules, like what, you know, the frequency at which they sort of jiggle has to be the same as the frequency of something else, or otherwise, you know, this won't work and that won't work. And you start getting like, there's all these dials, dozens and dozens of them. And if any single one of them is adjusted like 0.3%, nothing works. You know, maybe there's still a universe, but all you have is hydrogen, you know, because you can't have atomic like fusion to make more complicated things, or maybe there's nothing at all, or maybe, you know, you adjust any one of the variables and the whole universe doesn't exist, or the whole universe has expanded so fast it just blew apart, or it collapsed again on itself, or none of which leads to intelligent life on Earth as we understand it. And I think that argument has become so strong that I think it was Hitchens who was asked, like, what's the strongest argument, on the deist side? And he was like, fine tuning. He even fessed up to that. And I think the fine tuning argument is so strong that there's, that whole thing of like, well, if you roll the dice enough times, you'll get the right thing. Well, the reality is we live in a universe that's like 1 in 100 billion chance to get all of those variables right so that it would be the right environment for us. It's so daunting. You've got, again, even skeptics who talk about, it seems like somebody monkeyed with all the variables. It seems like somebody set this up, they'll concede that. Like, it looks like that argument has become so strong that if you still want to be a skeptic, then you have to posit a multiverse. There's lots of universes, and we just happen to be in the right one. We're just in the one that hit all the things right. There's all these billions of other universes where all the dials are different, and either there's no life, or there's whatever, or it's too hot, or it's too cold, or it's too this, or it's too that, or carbon doesn't work, or something that you can't have life. We're just in the right one. I don't know that anyone ever talked about a multiverse until fairly recently, in the last 100 years. And I think it's really just a response of skeptics to the fine-tuning argument. And I think what you're seeing is that as the science really shifts in our favor, the Big Bang is clearly in our favor, DNA is clearly in our favor, and on and on and on and on. The science is becoming, I think, in my opinion, and I'm subjective, heavily in our favor, that they have to come up with something. And so then they're like, multiverses, there's more of them. We're just lucky. And so, and now you're seeing it propagate itself throughout the culture. All of a sudden, there's movies about, Spider-Man in the multiverse, and the Guardians of the Galaxy in the multiverse, and
you're still left with, even if you want to believe in the multiverse, you just have to believe. You just have to get to the original like matter being created from. Yeah, you still have materialism coming from.
Well, and a multiverse requires a universe generating machine, which in itself, that's God, by the way. The thing that makes universes, that's God. But you end up, they postulate that there's a thing out there that
makes universes,
and they're all different. It like changes the dials and shoots another one out. Well, it turns out mathematically that was a real thing, that it has to be finely tuned to exacting specifications in order to do that. And so all you've done is just punt the problem down the road somewhere else, which doesn't make any sense at all. And this is all garbage. This is all garbage.
I agree. I mean, I don't, there's so many directions I could go with this, but the thing that it makes me think about as you really play out the multiverse hypothesis is that you ultimately end up that everything's meaningless. Because with an infinite amount of universes comes an infinite amount of realities, with an infinite amount of things, in which I've heard someone say, maybe it was Hugh Ross, say, well, what you're going to end up with is that, or maybe it was in this interview actually, where he says like, you'll just get a tree where when bark falls off of it, Shakespeare just happens to be written on the inside of the bark, you know, or every mathematical equation ends up just being chance. And it's like, well, because if you play it out to infinity, that's the only way it really works. And then you end up that everything is meaningless because it all is chance. In another universe, you didn't think about it. It just happened there. So therefore, you didn't ever really think about it.
No, it's all foolishness.
Well, now I get my kind of point on that is that you basically just end up without like a biblical worldview or without belief in a creator, like you end up with meaninglessness.
All of us have baseline assumptions that we believe we can't prove. My fundamental belief about Christianity is that our faith is reasonable. That, there are some holes we can't totally close, but I think we get closer to closing all the holes than anyone else. And it's reasonable to assume trust in God, trust in Christ, to finish out the bits and bobs that we can't quite wrap our heads around.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't think that's reasonable.
Right. That
there's a universe print stamping machine out there beyond the universe somewhere, just spitting out universe I. It doesn't make any sense, Yeah. So
no, I think that's true. All right.
So that's just God. God makes universes. So you just postulated God. Congratulations.
All right. So I have some more, but I think for the sake of time, maybe we could get into some of the stuff when they start talking about his like Christian faith and belief in the Bible.
Yeah, go for it.
And whatnot.
Whatever you play, I'm going to react.
All right. So
You play it, I react to
skip
it.
ahead a bit here.
How do you reconcile with the reality that the Bible was written down, at least, by human beings, and that human beings are generally unreliable? At least in terms of 100% accuracy, and also inclined to manipulate each other, especially when they're in control of large groups of people, and also inclined to appease the instincts and the desires and needs of their followers. So they create texts that resonate with the people and develop a philosophy that resonates with the people. And if they say that it comes from God itself, who, especially if it resonates, especially if it makes sense, and maybe perhaps it is in some way from God because it is coming from this divine inspiration. But how do we know? When something's written down, and also we're translating it, right? We're translating it from, Aramaic, from ancient Hebrew, and it goes into Latin and Greek, and there's a lot going on there. And then eventually to English, and there's a lot of room for interpretation.
That's like the entire essence of our podcast. The land and the by word. Like, we believe in the word. He's like, how can you trust the word?
Well, and I think there's kind of two things that he was saying there. And he was saying, like, how can you trust the Bible if it was written by people because people want to manipulate or corruptible? And then the second one was, how can you trust it because it was passed down and translated? So it's kind of two different things, but those are things that you hear a lot of time. And I think we touch on, a lot.
Well, let's start with the first one.
Yeah. So
the first accusation.
Well, and so like for me, the answer to the first one is,
we work more on the second one. We work a lot on the translational and cultural issues.
Yeah, I think so. Well, and is that,
because I don't believe in the first one.
Are the translations reliable? So like, but I think the answer to the first one is like, well, have you read the biblical text compared to other texts? Have you read how unique the Old Testament is? I mean, people will try to tear it apart and be like, oh, it says this awful thing, and potentially out of context or not really understanding who it was written to and how God was using progressive revelation, I believe, at the time. But I would say compare it and see how unique it is and unique the stories are and how, like, we've talked about this before, like how mind-blowingly different Israel was and what they were being taught about God and who God was and how to interact with God and how to interact with each other. What would you say?
Well, I would just say regarding the origin of the text, it's definitely not normative Middle Eastern storytelling. Normally when you had the annals of the kings of Egypt or Assyria or Babylon, it was all glorification and zero introspection. It was like, Ramses is amazing. Ramses conquered stuff. Ramses, looks good. Ramses, like all the ladies like him. Like, he's so smart. You didn't have realistic, well, he really screwed up this war. And, let's be honest, he's kind of a fat, ugly kid, but
you're not going to get the story of David, is what you're saying.
Yeah. So, it's so, or even the story of Moses where he's like, I'm not a good speaker and I murdered somebody. And, like, even, and it goes on and on and on, you've got Gideon. The angel of the Lord is like, you brave warrior. And he's like hiding in a hole from the bad guys. He's like, where's the brave warrior? I'm the one down in the hole hiding out. And who would tell a hero story like that? The guy who's supposed to be the hero, who eventually becomes the hero, it was certainly not to start things out.
Is there like ever like a,
or the Samson
I guess
story.
Maybe Joseph is probably only the real hero.
Joseph and Daniel come off real good in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Really nothing bad is said about them.
Because even like Elijah who does some
Elijah
amazing
and
stuff.
Elisha come off pretty good.
But Elijah still has
he
his
has
moments
failure
of
moment.
fear.
Yeah, he has his failure moment. Elisha really doesn't. Elisha's kind of
Yeah.
a superhero in a way.
But most of the time, you're getting like a very human interpretation.
Yeah, you get the breakdowns and the weaknesses for sure. Okay, there's that. There's all sorts of embarrassing. You go flip over to the New Testament. There's all sorts of real embarrassing moments or odd things. You know, the women finding the body, being honest about Peter's failures, his denial.
Just Peter in general. He's just saying dumb stuff all the time.
And then saying he's our leader, you know, like he's the boss after Jesus went away. And you're like, ugh.
They're like, have you read the Gospels?
Yeah. So, you know, and there's plenty of stuff like that I don't think you would do if you were trying to just make something up that was self-aggrandizing. But the other thing that he has just a very, very foundational, fundamental misunderstanding regarding the origin of the text. Because his whole deal is, well, if you were in charge of millions of people and trying to manipulate them, and you just kind of say stuff they liked, and you would say stuff that helped you do that manipulating, you know, that's his concept of like how we got the text. That's not even close to accurate. And you look at your gospel text, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these are written by people that the authorities probably want to kill and have tried to kill in the context of John, you know? Mm-hmm. So these aren't the great manipulators of the multitudes. They're hiding out in caves or, you know, hanging out in prison islands, writing their memoirs. There's no great manipulation here. Mm-hmm. And
well, maybe the Old Testament. How would you couch that for the Old Testament?
I still don't believe the argument. It could be made better for certain parts of the Old Testament. You know, so a lot of skeptical scholars will tell you that, for instance, you know, big chunks of the Torah were revised, edited, and changed.
The documentary hypothesis.
Yeah, sort of during the Babylonian captivity, they went back and re-edited and changed some things. I don't tend to go there just because, as I've already said, I tend to assume the traditional answer is accurate until it's really disproven. And I'm not a super fan of the sort of German high critical stuff that arose about 100 years ago.
I mean, this is like, I don't know if this is tangential, but I mean, it kind of goes the way you said, but like, I mean, I know you've said before, you're going to go with Moses as the author of the Torah. Yeah. And I the more I've dug into some of that stuff, the more I'm there as well, where it's just like, you know, it makes sense. Like if he was Egyptian royalty, he would have
understood government and understood literacy and been a writer.
Yep. All those things. And the ritualistic furniture that the of the Ark of the Covenant matches, you know, because that's what they knew. Again, it matches Egyptian furniture. So there's like all these context clues in those books, the amount of Egyptian loan words that are in those books. It makes sense that it's like, it's highly, it
doesn't make sense that you would be in captivity in Babylon 500 years later, borrowing Egyptian words.
Yeah. You're borrowing Egyptian loan words. There's the same amount as it's something like twice as many as there are in the rest of the Bible. Yeah. Is in those, they're just in like Numbers, Deuteronomy, Exodus, like kind of like those books. It's pretty remarkable. And I'm like, yeah, you know what? It does make a lot of sense. It seems to me the most plausible explanation.
That's a funny explanation because you have like Moses writing his own death saying like Moses was the most humble man that ever lived. And by the way, he was still virile at 120, you know? So it makes for some funny writing, you know, if you assume this self-authorship. But I, you know, at the end of the day, that's where I land.
I mean, well, John said that he raced to the tomb and got there first.
Yeah. He beat Peter to this. Yeah. And that one kind of makes sense. Like that one lends credibility to me because it feels like a little sibling rivalry, you know, that he's like, oh yeah, I got there first. And I'll put this. Yeah. People reading this 2,000 years from now, sucker, you know?
Yeah.
But regarding the Old Testament, and was it written to manipulate the masses, that whole thing? They killed Isaiah. They chopped him in half, you know? So if it was written to manipulate, he didn't do a very good job of it. And you could kind of go on and on. You know, the Psalms, how are they manipulative? They're the Psalm book. I don't know.
Well, I think that's a comment made a lot of times. People make comments about the Bible when they haven't read it. And they don't necessarily understand it.
Now, you could make an argument about 1st, 2nd Samuel and 1st, 2nd Kings that they are very, very pro House of David, not very pro Israelite, and not very pro House of Saul. There could be an argument made there that, there's a little bit of the victors writing the history going on in those books. I would still accept the inspiration of them. I could see where you would make that argument regarding those books. But by and large, not so much. I mean, and use the civil biographies like, Esther or Ruth. Like, I don't really know how that manipulates the masses. The New Testament it's just simply not true at all. It's simply not true in the New Testament. They are running and hiding and being killed and slaughtered. And the idea that Constantine could gather up, this is what they argue, is that like, at Nicaea, Constantine swept up all the Bibles and adjusted them to his needs. That's preposterous. I mean, the Christians were dying in mass 10 years prior to this is when Diocletian is running around killing people like left and right, trying to get all the Bibles. They're dying to defend these things. And you really think just 10 years later, with a little bit of offer of like, I'll be friends with you if you'll be nice to me, give me all your Bibles so I can change them, that all the Christians, all the millions of them, are going to be like, here, take our Bibles and change them, and we'll get rid of all the fake ones, okay?
Well, we have manuscripts that date back before that. Yeah,
we do, and we have manuscripts from outside the Roman Empire as well.
Yeah.
So it's just preposterous that there was some manipulation done to somehow manipulate the masses. It's just simply not true. It's really, really horrifically bad history.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so I guess we covered that one. All right, I think there's probably at least one more. All right, so this next clip, I've just got it as kind of like reliability of the Old Testament and history. That's what I have it labeled as.
Yeah.
So let me play this one and then we'll comment on it.
Okay.
What do you make of more ancient scriptures? What do you make of like the Old Testament? What do you make of the origins of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Like what do you think of that?
I actually have taught college classes that included an evaluation of the historical reliability of the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And in many, many periods of biblical history, there is just same kind of extensive extra-biblical corroboration of the history that's provided in the Old Testament. So I think the same types of evidences can be brought to bear to provide external support. One example, it was a favorite lecture of mine, was the story of the Assyrian invasion of Judah in 701 BC. It's recorded in Kings and Chronicles. And Hezekiah is the king. And there are multiple points of agreement between the biblical record and the account of that same event in the Assyrian records, many of which are now stored in the British Museum. There's a fantastic tour you can take of the Assyrian room there, where the absolutely the same basic story is told.
But these are historical representations of things that are plausible, like sieges, things that happened all the time. It's a part of human history.
Well, right. There's something kind of mysterious about this siege and why it was broken, because the Assyrian power was overwhelming in comparison to what was left. And the biblical account is that God himself created confusion in the ranks of the Assyrian soldiers.
Is that really how God would handle it?
Well, we don't know.
Why didn't God do that
for
with
one
World War
reason
II?
or another? Yeah.
Why didn't God stop Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Well,
why did God allow the Holocaust to take place?
Why did he allow the fog to descend at Normandy? I mean, I don't know.
Well, that was cool.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of, so there's two parts to that, right? There's like,
yeah. So let's just summarize the first part, 'cause I think Meyer answered it really well. The beginning of all that is Meyer, Rogan's like, well, what do you about the Old Testament and like this kind of stuff, and he's arguing that you can defend the Old Testament as a document, that there's plenty of corroboration of the Old Testament
stuff,
and the historical record. That's exactly right. And he goes into this discussion about the Sennacherib siege of Jerusalem, where Hezekiah was the king. And, he goes through all of that, and he's talking about how in Assyria, the carvings there, the dates match up and the story kind of matches, and that's really cool. And that supports the Old Testament. And you could do that with, there's tons of things.
Well,
like
and
that.
I'll say about that, we're going to have a video on that, because I went, and he mentions it, I went to the London Museum and I filmed the entire Assyria room and
fun.
the Egyptian room. And I'm doing a video on the Egyptian stuff and how it relates to your Bible, and then I'm going to do one on the Syrian stuff, and it's got all kinds of cool stuff that he actually just mentioned in that video. So tune in and you can see that video on our channel. But yeah, there's the Exodus. There's what else?
The Moab Stele, where it talks about like defeating the house of David, which, you know, the first time we see that in writing. There are extra-biblical writing. So there's lots of things that we found that corroborate the Old Testament as well as the New. But what I found actually more interesting, you know, as philosophical level, is at the end of it all, Meyer says, and the siege was broke off because, you know, God did a miracle and sowed confusion in the Syrian army, and they left. And then Rogan's like, is that really how God would act? So he's sort of like, he's like accusing God a little bit of like, oh, that was sort of like, you're being a bad actor. You know, you're confusing people. You shouldn't be doing that. So there's a little bit of accusation.
That doesn't sound miraculous, you know? So people just got confused. You know, it's almost like, you know,
they start attacking each other or they flee. They don't really know. But then he's like, and why didn't he do that at, you know, you kind of name, I think he names Auschwitz or Hiroshima or, and you start naming sort of bad things that happen, or the Titanic or the whatever. You know, why did God work a miracle? If you're going to argue for miracles and you're going to argue for this miracle, then you have to also explain why these other miracles don't happen. And let me just say that for Christians, when you start proclaiming the judgment of God on certain things, you know, God did this miracle for this person, you do inherently bring up the question of then, well, if God did a miracle to save this person, why didn't he do a miracle to save that person? He has liked them better. You know, what's wrong with him? And that's a you know, you do have to be careful in making those proclamations, or like reading the purpose of God into history. You know, when you don't really know the end from the beginning, you're a creature dropped into the middle of the story that can't see the beginning or the end, frankly. So, you know, I give you an example of this in regular life. I have a friend who, I don't know if you remember this or not, but it's been several years back now, but maybe close to 10 years now, I guess, when there was this horrific tornado that went through Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This thing was like 1.5 miles wide in the base. It was on the ground for like 15 or 16 miles, and tons of people got killed by this thing. Utter destruction. I have some friends who live in the middle of that path, and I went to their house before in this beautiful sort of wooded area. It's really, really nice. And one of the things that God sort of gave me is a really good sense of direction. Like I usually find, if I can find something once, I usually find it twice. You know, I'm pretty good with direction. And I went to go back a couple years later, and as I was driving in, I was like, I thought I turned right at this road, but and what was wrong was the fact that literally a 1.5 mile wide swath of the city that then went several miles long, it's like God took his hand and scraped it. All the trees were gone. And so that wooded area that I drove through to get to their house was no longer wooded. It was scraped. All the trees had been just, you know, it's an incredibly powerful thing. Mm-hmm. Well, I also have a friend who's on the police force there, and this friend who's on the police force told me something. He was like, Jameson, if you weren't a believer in God before this, you would be now, if you had seen what I've seen. And I was like, really, what have you seen? He's like, Jameson, we had to go and catalog dozens, if not hundreds of houses. And every single home we went into, I was told the exact same story when we, you know, did the write-up. The exact same story was, we were in the house, we were hanging out. Then we heard a tornado coming. We looked outside. It was huge. We didn't have time to get away. So we were like, where should we go? And we picked a room, maybe a bathroom under some stairs, whatever. They picked the place they thought was strongest. We all went there. It passed over. When it was gone, we came out, and the entire house was destroyed, totally scraped off the foundation, gone, except the room we were in. And he was like, I heard that story over and over and over and over again. There's no way you can see what I've seen and not believe in God. Well, okay, frankly, I accept that testimony. But then you have to answer the question, what about the 300 people or so that died that day? If God worked this miracle and saved tens of thousands of lives, which is what my friend would argue, or thousands, what was wrong with those people he didn't? That's a tough question.
Right.
What I would argue is that as Christians, we have to be really, really humble when we start to approach these things. When we start to approach these things of like, this disaster happened because it was the judgment of God on this city or this place or this nation, or this thing happened because, he mentions Dunkirk, why did the fog descend at Dunkirk? That's a crazy thing in history. I mean, you have the Nazis ready to drop the hammer on the British Army, totally would have wrecked them on that beach. There would have been no rest of World War II. It would have been over. Fog rolls in for a week. The Luftwaffe couldn't fly, no air cover for the Germans. In the meantime, every single English person with a boat, sails over to Holland and pulls people off the beaches at Dunkirk, saves the British Army. They could fight another day and eventually win the war. Is that God? My intuition is yes, it was. But again, why did God save them and not somebody else? So I do think we have to be very careful. And I think the Bible gives us some insight into this. And we did a whole episode on Dothan a long time ago. So I don't want to tell the whole story, but there's two stories at Dothan. One is the story of Elisha the prophet, and his servant looks out. It's like, we're surrounded, we're going to die. And Elisha's like, look
There's
again.
Angels. Yeah.
Oh, we're surrounded by angels and chariots of fire. We're fine.
Angel armies.
There you go. Or it looks like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you, or like whatever. Pick a song about that event. People are like, yay, God can save you with angels.
Yeah.
But you know what else happened there? What else happened there was Joseph got thrown in a pit. I bet he prayed just as hard as Elisha did.
Yeah.
God, please, God, please, God, please don't let me be sold as a slave. And his brothers hauled him out of that pit, tied him up, and sold him into slavery in a country he didn't know.
Yeah.
And so you're like, well, why didn't God do this? Well, the reason God didn't save Joseph is because he was working out a plan to save his whole family and whole nations. He wanted to change the character of Joseph's family. His brothers were murderous and awful. And they needed to feel that guilt and repent, which they did. Next time you see them years later, they're a lot better guys. And also Joseph was kind of a young, cocky jerk, and that needed to be worked out of him. So God is at work in the salvation, in the miracle, and in the absence of the miracle. God's equally at work in both. And we don't know the end from the beginning. Joseph, as a 13 or 14-year-old being sold, did not know what God was working at,
Yeah.
that he was still at work. So that kind of thing, that kind of generality, well, if God did that miracle, why didn't he do this one? God's bad because he's not nice. I think we have to humbly trust God.
Yeah, and I'll say one final thing on that, on miracles. If miracles were not infrequent things, then they wouldn't be miracles. They would just be normal.
Yeah.
And they would be like a lot of other things that we see that are absolute miracles that we don't even think are miracles.
Yeah, it'd be like childbirth, right? Which should be called a miracle. We're just like,
I mean,
or a flower blossoming, or
you can argue so many things in nature, just like, oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, it's proven by science that it happens, but that's just because it happens all the time.
Yeah, and we stop appreciating it.
Yeah, and you can say that things. So, like, I think Meyer actually, he says in here, like, it's not necessarily that miracles are breaking the laws of nature. It's just, I mean, God is like
kind of shaking the table, is how he calls it,
speaking into it, right?
Yeah, and C.S. Lewis spoke to your point. C.S. Lewis, postulated, he's like, what if the world is like a chess game, and so in your life, you if the game is going to be real, your life, then you have to do things, and then there's a consequence, and you do things, and there's a consequence. There should be like, I move, you move thing that you're doing, a dance you're doing with the world. You do a thing. If it's a smart move, you get a reward. If it's a bad move, you get punished. And life should kind of flow naturally. Like occasionally in a chess game, a referee might come and adjust a piece. Like maybe you made an illegal move. You put your knight where he couldn't have actually gone, and the referee's like, hold on, that goes there. Oh, sorry. Or just maybe you put a piece where it's kind of like on the edge of a square, they adjust it back. So the referee may occasionally adjust a piece in order to make the game continue to flow. But if the referee was just constantly grabbing pieces and moving them around, it would quickly cease to be an effective chess game. It just wouldn't work anymore.
Yeah.
If they were just constantly randomly like, here's a new queen. Okay, I'm gonna move this over here. Like, what are you doing? Nothing makes sense anymore.
Right.
So yeah, the miracle has to be infrequent. Otherwise, the game becomes so like detached from like actions and consequences in doing anything real that our lives would be farces at that point, you know?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I just don't think God can do that. He'd be unwise to do it. And so, I mean, I wish he would just do all the stuff I asked him to do.
Yeah.
But probably that would be bad for me. So,
right. Well, that's probably all I have time for. This one's been pretty long, but it'll be,
too bad you could vet it.
It'll be chopped down. But yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed this one. There's still so many more in here that we could touch on and talk about. But it was a great interview.
Yeah, there's one thing that maybe I'll just throw this out there, and you can cut
ahead.
it out later. But I think there's a general thing that happens with skeptics that I find annoying, which is that they apply a standard of proof to the Bible that they do not apply to anything else on earth. You know, so he's talking about like James, the brother of Jesus, and all these corroborating historical facts. And it's like, yeah, well, you know, but what was his mental state? You know, it's like, do you really ask about the mental state of, you know, the biographers of Napoleon or people like that? Like you don't push anything else this hard.
Right.
Now, granted, you're talking about life and death and eternal consequences, and it should be pushed kind of hard.
Yeah.
But the Bible is so much more substantial than any other historical document.
It comes down to the resurrection.
But they want to push it. Like they just don't want to believe. They're like,
yeah, exactly.
I don't see it. I don't see it.
It comes down because it comes with moral implications, and it comes down to believing something that a skeptic says you can't believe. And again, I think a lot of that goes back to roots are in Hume in a lot of ways.
But that's an a priori assumption they're making. And no matter what the evidence piles up to say maybe it happened, they're still like, I don't believe.
Well, and I think I would say that if you're a materialist and you think that the physical world is all there is, you still have to have life from non-life at the beginning of creation. They've not figured out how to get around that yet.
No.
That Peter Atkins, I guess he says when absolutely nothing rolled over into absolutely something. That's his way of saying that something came from nothing. He doesn't want to say it came from it.
Saying absolutely gobbledygook.
It rolled over, just like me in my bed when I can't sleep on this side anymore. I just roll over. So yeah, I mean, it has to come from. It has to come from something. I think they even said in this interview, you're allowed one miracle, and that's where everything came from. So anyways,
yeah,
I don't know if you can believe that. Why can't you believe that God would raise someone from the dead?
No, but they don't want to.
Well, I'm just saying, yeah, whether or not you want to or not, that's fine. But I don't know why you can't if you can believe that creation came from non-life. Why can't the most influential person in history?
I'm just constantly almost befuddled. I'm not shocked. It's just like quizzical. Like, huh? Regarding the amount of skepticism that they pile up. You know, the one guy we were talking about earlier, I saw the interview where he was like, if God came and spoke to you and like you saw him.
That's the same guy, Peter Atkins.
Yeah. Then he was like, no, I would just think I was hallucinating.
He said, well, if I would die and went to heaven and saw God, I would say, yeah, I'm probably just hallucinating.
It's like, okay.
Well,
so
you can't be convinced. No, you're right. I can't.
So it's like, oh, then why are we even talking at this point?
Well, yeah, at any rate, this was a fun exercise. So we hope everyone's enjoyed it. And we'll see you next time for more Land in the Bible content. Everywhere it's streaming.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, click like and subscribe. It really helps us. And if you really enjoyed it, go on over to our website, thelandinthebible.com, and become a supporter. It helps us generate more content and gives you access to our full library of video and Bible study content.